I have always believed that my life had a defined purpose. For over 2 decades, I have walked the path of faith, devoting every moment to serving God and guiding those who seek Him. My days were immersed in prayer, confession, and the solemn beauty of the Holy Mass. There was no greater joy for me than standing at the altar, sensing the presence of the divine, and offering comfort to those in need. Each morning, before the first light of dawn, I would rise, kneel by my bedside, and dedicate my day to the Lord. The scent of burning candles and aged wood in the church was as familiar to me as the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Every sermon, every whispered prayer, every tear shed in the confessional reminded me of why I had embraced this path. It was not just a calling, it was my very essence. I had witnessed both joy and sorrow in the eyes of my parishioners. I had seen miracles of faith and the crushing weight of despair. I had held the trembling hands of the dying, offering them the assurance of God's mercy, and I had baptized the innocent, welcoming them into the light of Christ. Though my life was demanding, it was deeply fulfilling. I never questioned that I was exactly where I was destined to be. But everything changed that morning. It began like any other, or so I believed. The sky outside was a gentle shade of blue, the air crisp with the promise of a fresh start. As I entered the sacristy, I felt the soothing rhythm of routine envelop me. My hands moved with practiced precision, arranging the sacred vessels and smoothing the fabric of my vestments. This sacred ritual always brought me peace. I murmured a prayer, as I always did before Mass, asking God to guide my words and bless the souls gathered before Him. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing appeared unusual, yet an inexplicable heaviness weighed on my chest. Initially, I dismissed it, thinking it might be fatigue or the burden of my responsibilities. But as I reached for the chalice slipped from my grasp, my fingers trembling as a sharp pressure gripped my ribs, and my breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded too fast, too erratic. The walls of the sacristy blurred, and the air thickened around me. I tried to steady myself, to will my body into submission. I could not collapse now, not before Mass, not here. But then the world tilted. The chalice slipped from my hands, and before I could cry out, my knees buckled beneath me. A cold sweat broke across my skin, and my vision darkened at the edges, narrowing until there was nothing but a tunnel of fading light, and then nothing. Everything fell away. The weight of my body, the distant murmurs of the church beyond the sacristy, and the very sensation of being tethered to the world. I felt it all vanish. I did not know if I was dying, but something deep within me whispered that I was no longer where I once was. I was falling, yet I felt no impact. The sensation of weight, gravity, and the very laws that governed my existence had dissolved into nothingness. One moment, I had been struggling for breath, feeling my body betray me, and the next, silence. A silence so complete, so absolute, that for a fleeting second, I thought I had simply ceased to exist. But I did exist. I was aware of myself, of my thoughts, and of something beyond the physical world I had always known. The overwhelming tightness in my chest, the weakness in my limbs, all of it was gone. I felt free, not as though I had been released from something, but rather as if I had been returned to what I was meant to be all along. Darkness surrounded me, but it was not a darkness of fear or sorrow. It was vast, infinite, like the space between stars, silent yet expectant, as if something unseen was about to reveal itself. Then, a shift. From somewhere beyond my understanding, a warmth began to spread. It did not come from a single point, nor did it move like light through a window. It was all-encompassing, gentle, yet immeasurably powerful. It did not touch my skin, for in this place I had no skin. Instead, it wrapped around the very essence of me, cradling me in an embrace so deep, so profound, that tears would have filled my eyes had I still possessed them. It was love. Pure, endless, unshaken love. And then, from the depths of that love, a presence emerged. At first, I could not see it, but I felt it. A knowing, a certainty, an undeniable truth that filled me from the inside out. I was no longer alone, and I knew without being told, without needing proof. I knew that He was here. The presence grew stronger, closer, not in the way that a person walks toward you, but in a way that filled the very space around me. I did not hear words, yet I understood. I did not see a face, yet I recognized Him. My soul trembled. For all the years I had spent preaching his name, for all the prayers I had whispered, for all the faith I had carried in my heart, nothing could have prepared me for the sheer majesty of standing in his presence. It was Jesus. Not as an image, not as the painted figure so often depicted in churches. No, this was beyond human understanding. He was light, but not light. He was warmth, but not warmth. He was everything, yet more than everything. And as I felt his presence fully, one truth became clear. He had been waiting for me. I could not move, yet I was not paralyzed. I had no body, yet I felt more alive than ever before. The presence before me, strong, radiant, infinite, was not just something I was experiencing. It was something I was becoming part of. There was no fear, no hesitation, only an overwhelming sense of belonging. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly whole. The light surrounding me was unlike anything I had ever seen. It did not simply shine, it pulsed, breathed, and carried a life of its own. It wrapped around me in waves, each one filled with warmth, peace, and a love so profound that I struggled to comprehend how I had ever lived without it. I was not standing, but I was there. And in this sacred space, I knew I was standing before Jesus Christ. I did not need to see his features to recognize him. His presence was undeniable, absolute. It was as if my soul had spent an eternity longing for this moment, and now here I was, face to face with the one I had preached about, the one I had devoted my entire life to serving. I expected my heart to tremble, for my soul to collapse under the weight of his magnificence. And yet all I felt was love, a love so consuming, so pure, that I could not fathom how I had ever doubted, ever feared, ever questioned my purpose in life. Though his voice had not yet spoken, I could already hear him, not with my ears, for I had none in this place, but in my heart, in the very core of my being. His words were imprinted as if they had been there since the beginning of time. You are here because I have called you. The words did not echo in sound, yet they resounded through me like the rush of a mighty river. And with those words came an understanding, one that did not require explanation or clarification. I was meant to be here. I'd been chosen to see what was beyond, to witness what so many longed to know but feared to seek. This was not death. This was truth. The light intensified, as if responding to my realization. And as it did, images, visions began to unfold before me. At first, they were nothing more than flickers, as if I were looking through ripples in a vast ocean. But then clarity came, and what I saw shook me to my core. I witnessed their souls grow dim, their spirits wither, and their connection to heaven slowly fade. Then Jesus spoke. His words were simple yet profound. The time is short. His voice was neither a whisper nor a booming thunder. It was a knowing, a certainty that resonated through every part of me. They do not see, they do not listen. The world is moving toward its own ruin, and still they do not turn back. There was sorrow in his voice, but not despair, only love. A love so immense and unshakable that even as he described the darkness consuming the world, I understood that he had not abandoned us. There is still time, he continued. As he spoke, new visions began to unfold before me. I saw people falling to their knees in prayer. I saw hands raised toward the heavens, voices crying out for mercy. I saw revival, souls awakening, hearts returning, and faith rekindling like fire piercing through the night. I understood that the world stood on the brink of something profound, both great and terrifying. But there was hope. There was still a chance for salvation, but only if we acted, only if we listened, and only if we turned back before it was too late. The visions faded, but the weight of what I had seen did not. Urgency pressed upon me, filling me with a responsibility I could not ignore. I turned to Jesus, my soul trembling, desperate to understand what I was meant to do. His eyes, radiant with compassion, held the answer before I even asked. I did not need to speak. The answer had already been etched within me. No matter what came next, I would not stop, not until every soul who was willing to listen had heard the truth. Not until every person who had drifted away from faith had been given one last chance to return. Not until I had fulfilled the mission that had been placed upon me by the King of Kings. For this was no longer just my calling, this was my destiny. I encountered individuals searching for something greater, yearning for a connection to the divine, but struggling to find their way back. I witnessed the impact of my words on the lives of those I met. Families were reunited, Broken friendships were restored, and hearts once weary were rekindled with faith. But it wasn't always met with open arms. I also faced resistance. There were those who dismissed me, labeling me as a man deluded by a near-death experience. However, I did not allow their doubts to shake me. I knew the truth of what I had seen. I understood the urgency of the message and the shortness of time. The world was teetering on the edge of something monumental, something that could either lead to salvation or destruction. As I continued to share my message, a clear pattern began to emerge. Those who listened, who opened their hearts to the truth, experienced profound changes in their lives. Their burdens felt lighter, relationships were mended, and their faith was reignited. But for those who turned away, who rejected the message, it seemed as though the weight of the world pressed down on them even harder. The truth itself had become a dividing line between those who would embrace the light and those who would remain lost in darkness. One evening, after delivering a particularly emotional sermon, an elderly woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She grasped my hands tightly and said, "Thank you, Father, for reminding us that it's never too late to return to God. I had given up hope, but your words have shown me that there is still time." I smiled at her, knowing that she was one of the reasons I had been sent back. Her faith, once dim, now burned brightly, and I knew she would carry that light into her family and community, spreading the message in ways I could never do alone. But there were moments of despair, times when I questioned if my efforts were enough. The visions of darkness consuming the world haunted my dreams, and the faces of those who had turned away lingered in my thoughts. I often wondered if I was failing, if I was truly fulfilling the calling that Jesus had entrusted to me. In those moments of doubt, I would retreat into prayer, seeking solace and guidance from the one who had sent me back. It was during one of those prayers in the small chapel of a quiet village church that I received a new revelation. The flickering candlelight cast shadows on the walls, and my heart felt heavy as I prayed, asking God if I was on the right path, if I was making a difference. Then, in the silence, a warmth enveloped me, the same warmth I had felt in His presence. It was a gentle yet powerful embrace, reassuring me that I was not alone. In that moment, a new vision unfolded before me. I saw a vast field filled with seeds. Some had taken root and grown into strong, healthy plants. Others had withered away, and some had yet to break through the soil. But the field itself was vast and brimming with potential. I understood the message. My mission was not to ensure that every seed would grow. My task was to plant the seeds, to scatter them far and wide, and to trust that in God's divine plan, the ones meant to flourish would do so in their own time. This revelation lifted the weight of doubt from my heart. I no longer needed to measure success by immediate outcomes. I simply had to trust that the work I was doing was part of a greater plan, one that I could not fully comprehend but knew was guided by the hand of God. And so, with renewed vigor, I continued. I traveled from town to town, sharing the message of hope and redemption, urging people to turn back to God and prepare for what was to come. I spoke not only in churches, but also in community centers, schools, and open fields, anywhere people were willing to listen. I shared my testimony, telling them about the love I had felt in Jesus' presence, the urgency in His voice, and the visions of both warning and hope. As the months passed, I began to see the ripple effects of my mission. Communities that had once been divided by conflict began to heal. Families that had been torn apart by resentment found reconciliation. Individuals consumed by despair rediscovered their faith. It was as though a wave of awakening was spreading. I knew that not everyone would heed the call, but the power of the seeds I had planted was becoming evident. Of course, my mission was not without challenges. There were those who sought to discredit me, calling me a fanatic and accusing me of spreading fear. But I understood that resistance was part of the journey. The truth was not meant to be easy to accept. It was meant to challenge, to awaken, and to stir the soul from complacency. I pressed on, knowing that even in the face of opposition, I was fulfilling the mission given to me by the King of Kings. One night, standing on a hill overlooking a small village where I had just delivered a powerful sermon, I gazed up at the stars scattered across the night sky. Each one was a reminder of the vastness of God's creation. I thought of the vision I had seen in his presence, the light, the revival, the hope. And I realized that this was only the beginning. The seeds I had planted would continue to grow long after I was gone. They would be watered by the prayers of the faithful, nurtured by the love of communities, and guided by the hand of God. In that moment, I made a silent vow. I vowed to continue planting seeds until my final breath, to never give up on the mission entrusted to me, and to trust that even when I couldn't see the results, God was working behind the scenes, orchestrating a divine plan beyond my understanding. The wind whispered softly around me, carrying the faint sounds of the village below. Families gathered in their homes, children's laughter mixing with the warmth of evening meals. It was a serene scene, yet beneath it all, I could feel the weight of what lay ahead. The world was still on the brink of something great and terrible, and my task was far from over. One afternoon, in a humble church nestled in the countryside, a woman approached me after the service. Her face was etched with sorrow, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn photograph of a young man in uniform. "This is my son," she whispered, her voice fragile and soft. "He died in a war far from home. I've prayed for years, but I don't feel his presence. I don't know if he's at peace." I gazed into her tear-filled eyes and gently took her hands in mine. "God's mercy knows no limits," I reassured her. "He sees what we cannot, and he understands the battles we endure, both the visible and the hidden ones. Your son is not lost. He is with God, and his soul rests in peace." The woman began to sob quietly, and I prayed with her, asking God to bring comfort to her heart and fill her spirit with the assurance that her son was embraced by divine love. As she left the church that day, her shoulders appeared lighter, as if some of the weight of her grief had been lifted, even if only a little. Encounters like this reminded me that my mission wasn't only about grand visions or public proclamations. It was about the quiet moments, the intimate, one-on-one exchanges where souls found solace and healing. It was about being present, listening, and offering the same hope that Jesus had given me so abundantly. But this mission was not without challenges. As I traveled and shared my testimony, I became more aware of the spiritual battles surrounding me. There were nights when I woke from restless sleep, feeling the oppressive presence of unseen forces trying to deter me. Doubts would creep in, whispering that my efforts were futile, that the darkness I fought against was too great to overcome. One night, as I knelt in prayer, I felt the familiar warmth of his presence wash over me. The doubts dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. I realized that fear was the enemy's most effective weapon, and by placing my trust in God, I had already claimed victory. From that moment, I resolved to face every challenge with unwavering faith, knowing that I was never fighting alone. One of the most powerful experiences occurred during a revival event at a large urban church. The air was charged with anticipation as hundreds of people gathered, their voices lifting in songs of worship and prayer. As I stepped onto the stage to speak, I felt the Holy Spirit flowing through the crowd. I shared the vision of Jesus, the urgency of his message, and the hope waiting for those willing to return to him. As I spoke, a man in the back of the church suddenly stood up, his voice breaking as he cried out, "I want to be saved. I can't live this life anymore." Tears streamed down his face as he made his way to the front of the church, where others soon joined him. The altar filled with people surrendering their burdens, their sins, and their fears, laying them at the feet of Jesus. In that moment, I understood the true power of God's love. It wasn't about saving just one soul. It was about creating a ripple effect of faith and transformation. For every person who surrendered that night, countless others would be touched by their testimony. As the event concluded and the crowd dispersed, I stayed behind, kneeling at the altar in silent prayer. I thanked God for his mercy, his grace, and for the opportunity to be his vessel. I prayed for continued strength to carry out the mission, for wisdom to guide those seeking the light, and for protection from the forces that sought to dim it. In the days that followed, letters and messages poured in from people who had attended the revival. They shared stories of healing, reconciliation, and renewed faith. A man who had been estranged from his family for years had reconnected with them, asking for forgiveness and starting fresh. A woman battling addiction had found the courage to seek help after hearing the message of hope. Each story was a reminder of the immeasurable power of God's love and the reach of His message. As I read those letters, I reflected on the parable of the sower. Not every seed falls on fertile ground, but the ones that do will produce a harvest beyond measure. My responsibility wasn't to control the outcome, but to faithfully sow the seeds, trusting God to bring about the growth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon behind the rolling hills of a small village, I sat by a stream, the water reflecting the soft golden light of the setting sun. I thought of the vision of Jesus, of the light that had enveloped me, and of the urgency in His voice. I thought of the people I had encountered, the lives that had been touched, and the seeds that had been planted. Though the path ahead was still uncertain, I knew one thing with certainty: I would not be walking it alone. Jesus had promised to be with me, and His presence was as tangible now as it had been during that sacred encounter. With every step, I carried His light, His love, and His message to a world desperately in need of hope. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, I whispered a prayer of gratitude. I thanked God for the mission He had entrusted me with, for the strength to carry it forward, and for the lives that had been transformed along the way. Rising to my feet, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, confident that although my journey was far from over, each step I took was part of His divine plan. As I made my way back toward the small village church where I had been staying, the cool night air embraced me gently. The village had quieted, its hum of life slowing as families retreated into their homes, their lights glowing softly through the windows. I passed by an elderly woman sitting on her porch, knitting by lantern light. She looked up and smiled warmly, and in that brief moment, I was reminded of the quiet strength of community, the bonds of faith that connected us all, even when we couldn't comprehend the mysteries guiding our lives. Upon reaching the church, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently and stepped inside, the familiar scent of aged wood and candle wax enveloping me. The altar was illuminated by the soft glow of flickering candles, casting dancing shadows along the walls. I knelt before it, resting my hands on the cool marble as I closed my eyes in prayer. "Lord," I whispered, "thank you for trusting me with this mission. I ask for your continued guidance and wisdom. Strengthen me when I feel weak, and grant me courage when doubt tries to creep in. Help me to be a light in the darkness and a voice of hope for those who have forgotten the sound of your name." As I prayed, warmth filled my chest, as though the divine had wrapped itself around me in a loving embrace. Tears welled in my eyes, not from sorrow, but from overwhelming gratitude and love. The next morning, before dawn, I packed my small bag, knowing it was time to move on to the next destination where I was needed. My mission was never meant to be stationary. The truth I carried needed to reach as many souls as possible. Before leaving the village, I made one last visit to the home of a family I had grown close to during my stay. Their daughter, Clara, had been struggling with feelings of unworthiness and despair. She had opened up to me during one of the evening services, her tears revealing the depth of her internal battle. We had prayed together, and I had spoken to her about God's unbreakable love and the light that could guide her out of the darkness. Over the course of the week, I had watched the beginnings of a transformation take root within her. That morning, as she opened the door, her eyes sparkled with a newfound sense of hope and purpose. "Father," she said with a soft smile, "I wanted to thank you. I feel like I can breathe again." I smiled back and rested a hand on her shoulder. "That's the power of God's love, Clara. Hold on to it tightly and remember, He's walking beside you, even when the path feels uncertain." Her grip on my hand tightened briefly as she nodded. "I won't forget." As I turned and made my way toward the edge of the village, a surge of hope lifted my spirits. Clara's renewed faith was one of many transformations I had witnessed, and it reminded me that even the smallest acts of trust in God could create monumental change. I thought about the parables Jesus had shared: the mustard seed, the lost sheep, the prodigal son. His teachings had always emphasized the power of redemption and the beauty of light found in the darkest corners of the soul. The road ahead took me through bustling cities, peaceful countryside villages, and coastal towns where the salty breeze carried whispers of distant horizons. In every place, I met individuals burdened by their own struggles, some worn visibly on their faces, others carefully hidden behind polite smiles. But regardless of the setting, the message was always the same. Jesus was calling them back, offering forgiveness, hope, and a chance to begin again before it was too late. One evening, as I stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, I watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of orange, pink, and gold. The rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks seemed to mirror the pulse of my mission. Just as the tides were relentless, ebbing and flowing without pause, so too was the call to spread God's message of salvation. I pulled a small journal from my bag and began writing, capturing my thoughts and recording the encounters that had shaped my journey. Each page was filled with stories of people rediscovering their faith, miracles of healing, and undeniable encounters with God's presence. The journal wasn't just a personal record of my mission, it was a testament to the unshakable power of faith. Even in the face of obstacles and moments of doubt, God's love had continued to break through, proving that no heart was too hardened to be touched. There had, of course, been difficult moments. Towns where my words were met with skepticism, where people dismissed my message or walked away uninterested. Those moments tested me, but I reminded myself of Jesus' own words. "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." I had learned that the path of faith wasn't meant to be easy, it was meant to be transformative. One particularly challenging encounter took place in a bustling city, known for its thriving markets and lively streets. As I stood on a street corner preaching, a group of young men gathered around, their faces a mix of curiosity and defiance. One of them, a tall man with hardened eyes, stepped forward, his voice laced with bitterness. "You speak of God's love," he said. "But where was that love when my family needed it? Where was God when my brother died, leaving me to pick up the pieces?" His words were raw with pain, and I could sense the internal battle raging within him. He wasn't just angry, he was longing for answers. I stepped closer, meeting his gaze with understanding. "I don't know the details of your pain," I said gently, "but I do know that God's love never left you. Even in your darkest moments, He was there, grieving with you, carrying you when you didn't have the strength to stand. Pain and suffering are part of this life, but they are not the end of the story. Healing is possible, and His love can guide you through." For a moment he didn't respond, his gaze lowering to the ground as if the weight of his pain had finally been acknowledged. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "How do I believe in that again?" "By taking one small step at a time," I answered. "By opening your heart, even if just a little, and trusting that God will meet you where you are." The young man nodded slowly, tears glistening in his eyes. "I want to try." As he walked away, I felt a sense of peace. I might not see the full outcome of that encounter, but I trusted that a seed had been planted. God would nurture it in His time. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, my journey continued. I became a traveler of faith, guided by the Spirit to places where souls longed for revival. Each new village, town, or city brought its own challenges, but also its own miracles. There were days when my body ached from the endless travel and the emotional weight of the mission. But every time I knelt in prayer, strength would be restored as if God Himself was lifting me from my exhaustion. The visions Jesus had shown me remained vivid in my mind. The flashes of suffering, the darkness creeping into human hearts, the urgency of the call to return to the light. Those visions haunted me during sleepless nights, but fueled me during the day, motivating me to reach as many people as possible. I knew I couldn't save everyone. I wasn't meant to. But I could be the voice that planted a seed, the spark that rekindled faith. In a small town, surrounded by rolling hills, I met a widow named Margaret. Her grief over losing her husband had left her feeling paralyzed and hopeless as she raised their 2 young children alone. Their home was filled with memories, his photographs, his belongings neatly arranged, but they had become painful reminders of what she had lost. After a Sunday service, Margaret confided in me, tears streaming down her face. "Every day feels like a punishment," she said. "I pray, but it feels like no one is listening." "Margaret," I said softly, taking her hands, "your prayers are heard, even when you don't feel it. Grief is not something you overcome, it's something you learn to carry. But you don't have to carry it alone." We prayed together every day that week. Slowly, I saw changes in her spirit. She began taking small steps, reorganizing her home, spending more time with her children, and even volunteering at the community center. By the time I was ready to leave the town, Margaret had found hope again. Her eyes no longer reflected despair, but determination. On my last day, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "You've given me back my life." I smiled and gently corrected her. "God's love gave you that strength. Never forget that He's walking beside you." As I left the town, I carried her story with me, just as I carried the stories of countless others. Each one reminded me that the mission about grand gestures. It was about the small but profound moments where faith was rekindled and lives were forever changed. If this story has touched your heart and inspired you, I invite you to join this journey of faith and hope. Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with others who may need to hear this message. Together we can spread the light of God's love, reaching souls in need, and creating a community built on faith, healing, and transformation. Thank you for being a part of this mission. May blessings follow you always.